Introduction and the wedding night too. Open your eyes in the dim candlelight, and your heart is beating so loudly you're certain everyone in the next room can hear it. The wedding feast is over. The music has faded. The laughter and toasts and bawdy songs have given way to an almost oppressive silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the rustle of heavy wool curtains being drawn. You're sitting on the edge of a bed you've never slept in before, in a room that smells of beeswax, dried herbs, and something else, something you can't quite name. Anticipation, maybe, or fear. Your hands are trembling as you smooth down the linen shift you're wearing, the one your mother embroidered with tiny flowers along the neckline. She cried when she helped you put it on earlier tonight, though she wouldn't say why. Your older sister whispered something in your ear before she left, something that was supposed to be helpful. But the words jumbled together, and now you can't remember if she said it would hurt or that it wouldn't, if you should be silent or if you should speak, if this was supposed to feel like love or duty or something else entirely. The door creaks open, and he enters, your husband. You've known him for 3 months, perhaps. Or maybe it's been a year of formal courtship conducted under the watchful eyes of both your families. He's not unkind. He smiled at you during the ceremony, and once, weeks ago, he brought you a ribbon from the market. But you don't really know him, not in the way you're about to. Welcome. Welcome to medieval Europe, somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries, though honestly, the decade matters less than you might think. Whether you're in a drafty castle in England, a timbered house in the German territories, or a stone cottage in rural France, the experience you're about to have this wedding night carries with it centuries of expectation, rules, fears, and hopes that have very little to do with you as an individual and everything to do with what society, the church, and your families need from your body. Before we go any further, let me pause for just a moment. If you're enjoying this journey into the intimate past, if you appreciate these deep dives into what life really felt like for ordinary people in extraordinary times, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'm always curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something beautiful about connecting across time and space like this. You in your modern bed, me telling you about someone else's bed centuries ago. Now, back to that room. Back to you, sitting there with your heart pounding and your hands cold despite the fire. Here's what you know, or think you know, about what's about to happen. You know that this act, this thing you're about to do, serves a purpose. The priest made that very clear during the marriage ceremony, and your mother's careful warnings circled around it like a bird afraid to land. You are here to produce children, heirs if your family is wealthy, workers if you're peasants, the continuation of bloodlines, the securing of alliances, the proof that this union is real and binding and sanctioned by God. But what you don't know, what nobody has actually explained to you in any practical detail, is how any of this works. You've seen animals mate, of course. You've lived close enough to farms and stables that the basic mechanics aren't a complete mystery. But you're not entirely sure how what the rooster does to the hen translates to human bodies. And the whispered giggles of your married friends gave you more questions than answers. One said it was painful. Another said it was over quickly. A third said her husband was gentle and patient, but she also blushed so deeply when she said it, that you weren't sure if that was good or bad. Your husband is unlacing his tunic now, and you realize with a start that you've never seen him without multiple layers of clothing. Neither of you has. The concept of privacy as we understand it doesn't really exist yet. People change clothes in shared rooms, bathe in communal tubs if they bathe much at all, and bodily functions are far less hidden than they'll become in later centuries. But there's still something profoundly exposing about this moment, about knowing that your body is about to become known to someone else in a way it never has been before. He sits beside you on the bed, and it dips under his weight. The rope supports creak. He smells like ale and smoke and sweat, but not unpleasantly, just humanly. He's nervous too, you realize. His hands are shaking slightly as he reaches for yours, and there's something oddly comforting about that, about knowing you're both stumbling through this together. What happens next unfolds in a strange blur of sensations and confusion. There's fumbling, there's awkwardness, there's a sharp pain that makes you gasp, and he freezes, murmuring an apology you barely hear over the rushing sound in your ears. The whole thing is over in minutes, maybe less, and then he's rolling away and you're lying very still, trying to process what just happened, whether it's supposed to feel like this, whether you did something wrong or he did, or whether this strange, anticlimactic, slightly painful experience is exactly what everyone meant when they talked about marital duty. This is sex in medieval Europe, or at least one version of it. One moment in an incredibly complex tapestry of beliefs, practices, fears, desires, and contradictions that governed how people understood their bodies, their pleasures, and their relationships. And here's what I want you to understand right from the start. Everything about medieval sexuality is a paradox. The Church preaches that sex is shameful, dangerous, and should be avoided, except for procreation. Yet it also insists that marriage is holy and that producing children is a sacred duty. Women are told their bodies are sources of sin and temptation, yet they're also pressured to be eternally fertile and available to their husbands. Men are expected to control their lusts, yet also to be potent and virile enough to father many children. And beneath all these rules and expectations, beneath the sermons and the laws and the social pressures, are actual human beings trying to figure out love and desire and connection in a world that gives them very little. Accurate information and an enormous amount of guilt. You're still lying there in that candlelit room, and you can hear voices outside, probably family members, waiting to congratulate you both, to make sure the deed is done and the marriage is sealed. In some regions and social classes, they'll be expecting proof, looking for blood on the sheets as evidence of your virginity, as if your worth as a person and a wife can be measured in a few drops of red. You feel exposed and raw and confused, and you wonder if this gets easier, if this strange act will someday feel like the love the troubadours sing about, or the passion the priests warn against. The answer is complicated. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Some medieval couples grew to love each other deeply, finding genuine tenderness and even pleasure in their physical relationship. Others endured sex as a joyless duty for decades. Most fell somewhere in between. navigating the strange territory of intimacy within the bounds of religious restriction, social expectation, and their own very human needs. Tonight, this night, you don't know which kind of marriage yours will be. You only know that you've crossed a threshold, literally and figuratively, and that your life has changed in ways you're only beginning to understand. Your body isn't entirely your own anymore. It belongs, in various ways, to your husband, your family, the church, and the social order that depends on your fertility and obedience. But here's the thing that nobody tells you, the thing that will take years to fully understand. Your body is also still yours. Your thoughts, your feelings, your small rebellions and secret pleasures, those remain your own even in a world that tries very hard to control every aspect of your sexuality. Medieval people, despite all the restrictions, despite all the fear and shame and regulation, still found ways to love, to desire, to experience joy in their bodies and their connections with others. This is the story of what sex was really like in medieval Europe. Not the sanitized version or the sensationalized one, but the messy, complicated, deeply human truth of how people navigated desire in an age of rigid rules. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore together. The night is long, and there's so much to discover. What they told you about your body, you're maybe 11 years old, maybe 13, sitting in the back of a cold stone church while the priest drones on in Latin you don't fully understand. But every so often, a word cuts through the fog of incomprehension. Sin, flesh, temptation, lust. He's talking about bodies, though he'd never use that word directly. He's talking about the dangers that lurk in your own skin, the wickedness that can bloom between your legs if you're not vigilant, prayerful, and obedient. This is your sex education, such as it is. Nobody sits you down for the talk in medieval Europe. There's no awkward but well-meaning parent pulling out diagrams or books. No school curriculum designed to explain reproduction in age-appropriate ways. Instead, you piece together information from fragments, sermons that focus on sin rather than mechanics, whispered conversations between older girls that end abruptly when adults approach, observations of animals in the farmyard, and a general atmosphere of shame and secrecy that tells you this topic is dangerous even before you fully understand what this topic actually is. The Church's message is clear and repetitive. Your body is not to be trusted. It's a temporary vessel for your immortal soul, and a rather unreliable one at that, constantly threatening to lead you astray with its appetites and urges. The priests explain that lust is one of the 7 deadly sins, right up there with pride and greed, and that sexual desire, even in marriage, should be carefully controlled and directed solely toward procreation. Pleasure, they warn, is a trap set by the devil. But here's where it gets confusing. Because while the Church insists that sex is shameful and dangerous, it also teaches that marriage is a holy sacrament and that producing children is your sacred duty. So sex is simultaneously sinful and sanctioned, shameful and necessary, something to avoid and something to embrace. How are you supposed to make sense of that? You can't, really. Nobody can. And so you grow up with a deep-seated confusion about your own body, never quite sure whether what you're feeling is natural or wicked, whether your curiosity is healthy or damning. If you're a girl, the messages are even more contradictory. You're told that women are the daughters of Eve, inherently more susceptible to temptation and sin. Your body, with its curves and softness and mysterious blood, is simultaneously a source of life and a source of corruption. The story of the Garden of Eden is invoked constantly. Eve tempted Adam. Eve ate the forbidden fruit. Eve brought sin into the world. Therefore, women's desires are particularly dangerous and must be especially controlled. At the same time, there's a strange undercurrent in medieval medical theory that suggests women are actually more lustful than men. This idea comes from ancient Greek medicine, filtered through Roman writers and medieval scholars. The theory goes something like this: women's bodies are cold and wet, lacking the hot, dry quality that makes men rational and self-controlled. Therefore, women need sex more than men do. Their cold bodies desperately seeking the heat that only male seed can provide. It's contradictory, bizarre, and completely wrong from a modern medical perspective. But it shapes how you're viewed and how you view yourself. You're simultaneously the tempter and the tempted, dangerous and endangered, lustful and in need of protection from lust. If you're a boy, your education isn't much better, just different. You're told that your seed is precious, a distillation of your very life force, and that wasting it through masturbation or excessive sex will weaken you, make you sick, potentially even kill you. You learn that women are temptresses who will try to steal your virtue and your seed, and that you must be constantly vigilant against their wiles. At the same time, you're expected to be potent, capable of fathering many children and satisfying your future wife's needs. The medical theories you might encounter, if you're educated enough to read them, are a wild mixture of ancient Greek ideas, Roman texts, and medieval interpretation. The four humors theory dominates medical thinking. Your body contains blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health depends on keeping these in balance. Sex affects your humors. Too much sex depletes your blood and dries out your brain. Too little sex, especially for women, can cause the womb to wander around the body, causing hysteria. Yes, you read that right. Medieval and ancient physicians genuinely believed that the uterus could become dislodged and travel through a woman's body, causing all sorts of problems. The solution: marriage and regular sex to keep the womb anchored in place. This theory persists for centuries, shaping how women's health and mental state are understood and treated when it comes to the actual mechanics of sex and conception. The information available to medieval people is spotty at best and wildly inaccurate at worst. Most people understand the basics. Man and woman come together. Seed is planted. Baby grows. But the details are fuzzy. Does the woman contribute seed too? Or is she just the soil in which the man's seed grows? Authorities disagree. Aristotle said women contribute only matter, while men contribute form and soul. But Galen, another ancient authority, suggested women produce seed too, and that both seeds must mix for conception to occur. This disagreement has huge implications for how female sexuality is understood. If women produce seed, then logically they need to experience pleasure and climax for conception to happen. This theory actually gives female pleasure a purpose and a legitimacy, at least within marriage. Some medieval medical texts explicitly state that a woman must reach climax for pregnancy to occur, and they advise husbands to take their time and ensure their wives are satisfied. It's a surprisingly progressive idea buried in an otherwise restrictive culture. But it comes with a catch. This pleasure is purely functional, a means to an end. It's not about a woman's enjoyment for its own sake, but about fulfilling her reproductive duty. Still, it's something. It's an acknowledgement that women's bodies have needs and responses, even if that acknowledgement is rooted in faulty biology. But most ordinary people don't read medical texts or theological treatises. They learn about sex through observation and gossip. You watch the bull mount the cow, the rooster chase the hen, the dogs coupling in the street. You hear the rhythmic creaking from your parents' bed in the tiny one-room cottage where the whole family sleeps. You listen to the knowing laughter of married women at the market, their jokes and knowing looks that exclude you until you join their ranks. You might have an older sibling or friend who explains things in halting, embarrassed terms. Or you might go into your wedding night knowing almost nothing, except that something will happen and it might hurt and you're supposed to submit to it, because it's your duty. The word duty comes up a lot. Sex isn't framed as something you might want or enjoy, but as an obligation. For women, it's the debt you owe your husband, a concept actually encoded in some church teachings. Paul's letter to the Corinthians states that husband and wife have power over each other's bodies, that neither should refuse the other except by mutual consent for prayer. In practice, this usually means wives are expected to be available whenever their husbands desire, regardless of their own feelings. For men, duty means performing adequately, being able to achieve erection and ejaculation, proving your virility and your ability to father children. Impotence is not just embarrassing, but potentially grounds for annulment. There are documented cases of men being examined by church authorities, sometimes required to prove their capacity in front of witnesses. It's humiliating and invasive, a reminder that your most private functions are subject to public scrutiny. Some practical information does circulate, particularly among women. Midwives and older women pass down knowledge about fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. They know about herbs that can prevent conception or induce miscarriage, though this knowledge is dangerous to possess. They understand the rhythms of women's bodies, the signs of pregnancy, the stages of labor. This female knowledge network operates somewhat underground, sometimes in tension with official church doctrine and male medical authority. You might learn that sex during menstruation is forbidden, considered unclean and dangerous. You might hear that certain positions are sinful, that certain days are prohibited, that talking about sex openly is shameful. You absorb these rules through osmosis, through the pained silence when you ask questions, through the way adults lower their voices and shoo children away when certain topics arise. What you don't learn, what almost nobody tells you, is that sex can be pleasurable, that your body is capable of sensations beyond pain and duty. That desire is a natural human experience, not purely a demonic temptation. That there are ways to be intimate with another person that bring joy and connection and even transcendence. These things you'll have to discover for yourself, if you're lucky. And you'll have to discover them while navigating a labyrinth of rules, restrictions, and expectations that seem designed to make pleasure as difficult and guilt-ridden as possible. Listening to the priest condemn the flesh, and you wonder about the strange stirrings in your own body. Are they sin? Are they natural? Are they something to confess and repent, or something to quietly accept and never speak of? You don't know. And in not knowing, you carry forward into adulthood a confusion about your own sexuality that will shape every intimate encounter you ever have. The church's rules and why everyone broke them. The priest closes his prayer book with a soft thump that echoes in the confessional, and you can hear him shifting on the other side of the wooden screen. You've just confessed to having relations with your husband on a Sunday, and now you're waiting for your penance, your heart sinking as you realize that what seemed like a natural expression of affection between married people is apparently a sin serious enough to require atonement. Welcome to the exhausting, all-encompassing world of church regulation of marital sexuality. Because here's what you need to understand. The medieval church didn't just have opinions about sex. It had rules. Lots and lots of rules. Rules about when, where, how, why, and with whom you could have sex. Rules so detailed and specific that following them all would require a calendar, a confessor on speed dial, and a level of self-control that most humans simply don't possess. Let's start with when you can't have sex, because that list is longer than when you can. Sundays are out. That's the Lord's Day, dedicated to worship and rest. And sex is considered work, or at least a distraction from spiritual contemplation. Fair enough, you might think. One day a week isn't too restrictive. But we're just getting started. Wednesdays and Fridays are also forbidden. These are traditional fast days, and apparently fasting includes abstaining from marital relations. There goes nearly half your week. Then there are all the feast days and holy days scattered throughout the calendar. Depending on your region and how strictly your local priests enforce the rules, this could mean dozens of additional forbidden days each year. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, is completely off limits. That's more than a month of required abstinence. The same goes for Advent, the period before Christmas, and the 3 days before taking communion, which in some parishes is weekly. And during menstruation, because a woman's monthly blood is considered unclean. And during pregnancy, once it's confirmed, because the baby is already conceived, so sex serves no purpose. And for a period after childbirth, often 40 days or more, until the woman has been churched and ritually purified. Are you keeping track? Because by the time you add all this up, you're looking at sex being forbidden for anywhere from 1/3 to half the entire year. Some scholars who've studied medieval penitential texts, those handbooks for priests hearing confessions, have calculated that married couples following all the church's rules would only have sex about 50 to 60 days per year. And that's just the timing. Now let's talk about positions. The church has strong opinions about this too. Missionary position, man on top facing the woman, is the only fully approved method. Why? Because it's considered natural. It mirrors the proper hierarchy with the man above and the woman below. And it's most conducive to conception, with gravity helping the seed reach its destination. Any other position is viewed with suspicion or outright condemnation. Woman on top. Sinful because it inverts the natural order and suggests female dominance. From behind. That's how animals do it, and humans should be better than beasts. Side by side, standing, sitting. All questionable at best, mortal sins at worst. The reasoning is partly about maintaining proper gender hierarchy and partly about a deep anxiety that pleasure-focused positions that don't prioritize conception are selfish and lustful. Even within the approved position, there are rules about attitude and intention. You're supposed to approach marital sex with the right mindset, procreation, not pleasure. The ideal is to perform the act with as little enjoyment as possible. Treating it excessive enthusiasm is suspicious. Moaning or expressing pleasure might warrant confession. The goal is to make babies, not to have fun. Some theologians even debated whether it was sinful for a man to love his wife too ardently, suggesting that excessive passion even within marriage was a form of adultery. You're supposed to love your spouse with proper Christian charity, not with the kind of burning desire that makes you forget yourself. Now, here's a question I'd love you to consider. How do you think medieval couples actually responded to these rules? Drop a comment and share your thoughts, because the historical evidence is fascinating. The reality, as you might expect, is that most people ignored a good portion of these regulations. We know this from several sources. First, the penitential handbooks themselves, which keep getting revised and updated precisely because people keep sinning in the same ways, suggesting the rules aren't being followed. Second, from confession records and church court cases that document all the various sexual sins people were committing. And third, from the simple mathematics of birth records, which show babies being born at times that suggest their parents weren't abstaining during Lent or Advent or holy days. Medieval people were creative in their justifications. Some argued that the rules applied only to the ultra-pious, not to ordinary lay people. Others claimed ignorance, saying their local priest had never mentioned these restrictions. Still others simply decided that some sins were worth committing, confessing them afterward, and accepting whatever penance was imposed. There's even evidence that many parish priests were lenient in enforcing these rules, recognizing that they were impractical and that requiring married couples to abstain for half the year was a recipe for adultery, prostitution, or other worse sins. A priest in a small village who knew his parishioners well might overlook minor infractions, focusing instead on more serious matters like adultery or violence. The confession system itself created an interesting dynamic. On one hand, it gave the church enormous power to surveil and regulate private behavior. People were required to confess at least once a year, and good Christians confessed more frequently. The priest would ask probing questions about your sex life, and you were obligated to answer truthfully or risk compounding your sins with lies. But confession also provided a release valve. You could sin, confess, receive penance, be absolved, and start over. For some people, this cycle became almost routine. Have sex on a forbidden day, confess it, do your penance, usually prayers, fasting, or almsgiving, and you're back in a state of grace. The system simultaneously condemned and accommodated human weakness. Penances for sexual sins varied widely depending on the severity of the offense, the frequency, and the attitude of the confessor. Having sex on a Sunday might earn you a few days of fasting or extra prayers. More serious violations, like sex during Lent or in forbidden positions, could result in weeks or months of penance. Repeat offenders faced harsher consequences. But here's the thing: enforcement was inconsistent at best. The Church in medieval Europe wasn't a monolithic organization with uniform policies. Different regions, different religious orders, different individual priests all had their own interpretations and priorities. A strict confessor in one parish might impose harsh penances for minor infractions, while a more relaxed priest in the next village might barely mention the rules at all. This inconsistency created confusion and resentment. Couples who traveled might find that what was acceptable in their home parish was considered sinful elsewhere, or they might discover that their priest was unusually strict compared to others. The rules felt arbitrary because, in practice, they were. There's also fascinating evidence that married couples developed their own private understanding of what was acceptable. They might agree between themselves to ignore certain rules they found unreasonable while following others that seemed more important. They created a kind of practical theology of marital sexuality that didn't always align with official church teaching. Some couples found ways to be intimate without technically having intercourse, engaging in what modern people might call outercourse or heavy petting. This allowed them to maintain some physical connection during forbidden periods without committing what they considered the more serious sign of full sexual intercourse. Whether this actually avoided sin in the Church's eyes is debatable, but it represented a compromise between desire and duty. Women, particularly, might have found some of these rules useful. A wife who didn't want to have sex could invoke church law, telling her husband that tonight was forbidden and he should respect religious authority. This gave women a rare tool for refusing their husbands without facing accusations of shirking their marital duty. Of course, it only worked if the husband was willing to respect these restrictions, and many weren't. The gap between the ideal and the reality was enormous. The Church preached total control, rational restraint, sex purely for procreation. But humans are not rational creatures when it comes to desire. And married couples living in close quarters, especially in the long dark nights of winter, found the Church's rules difficult, if not impossible, to follow. And so they didn't. Not entirely, anyway. They picked and chose, negotiated, rationalized, and confessed. They lived in the tension between religious expectation and human need, between the fear of sin and the pull of intimacy. They broke the rules and felt guilty about it, or broke the rules and didn't feel guilty, or tried to follow the rules and failed and felt terrible about failing. This tension, this gap between prescription and practice, is one of the defining features of medieval sexuality. The Church wanted total authority over the most private aspects of people's lives, but it couldn't fully achieve that authority. The bedroom remained, despite everything, a space where individuals and couples made their own choices, for better or worse, as you lie in bed next to your spouse, counting on your fingers how many days until you're religiously allowed to touch each other again. You might wonder if anyone actually lives by all these rules. The answer is probably not. And in that, probably not, in that small space of human resistance to impossible standards, medieval people found room to be themselves. Women's bodies. Women's burden you wake before dawn with a familiar ache in your lower back. And for a moment you allow yourself to hope, but then the nausea rises, sharp and undeniable, and you know with absolute certainty you're pregnant again. This will be your 5th pregnancy in 7 years of marriage. You've birthed 3 living children, and buried one tiny daughter who lived only 3 days. And now there will be another. Your body is not your own. It never has been, really. But marriage and motherhood have made this truth impossible to ignore. Your body is a vessel, a field to be plowed and planted, a resource to be used for the continuation of bloodlines and the production of workers. What you want, how you feel, whether you're ready for another pregnancy, these questions are irrelevant, even unthinkable. This is your purpose, your duty, your fate as a woman. Let's talk about what this means in practical terms. Let's talk about what it feels like to live in a female body in medieval Europe, knowing that your fertility is both your greatest value and your gravest danger. First, the sheer physical reality of constant pregnancy. If you marry young, perhaps at 15 or 16, and you remain fertile until your 40s, you could potentially bear children for 25 years. Without reliable contraception, most married women experience pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy. A woman might go through 10, 12, 15 pregnancies in her lifetime. Some of these end in miscarriage or stillbirth. Some result in children who die in infancy. But still, the pregnancies keep coming. Your body never fully recovers from one pregnancy before the next begins. You're breastfeeding an infant while carrying another child. Your teeth loosen from calcium depletion. Your body aches in ways that become so constant you stop mentioning them. You develop hemorrhoids, varicose veins, stretch marks that silver your belly and breasts. You're tired, bone-deep tired, in a way that sleep never quite fixes. And then there's childbirth itself. This is where the real terror lives, in the knowledge that every pregnancy might be the one that kills you. Maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe are horrifyingly high. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that somewhere between 1 and 2% of births result in the mother's death. That might not sound like much until you remember that most women give birth many times. If you have 10 children, you face that 1 to 2% risk 10 times. Over a lifetime of childbearing, your chances of dying in childbirth are somewhere between 10 and 20%, 1 in 5. Maybe worse. Those are the odds you're living with, and you know it. Every woman knows it. You've attended births where everything went well, where the baby slid out easily and the mother was up and working again within days. But you've also seen the other kind. You've seen women labor for 2 days or 3, growing weaker and paler, until finally they slip away, the baby still unborn or born dead. You've seen women bleed out in minutes, their life pooling on the birthing sheets while midwives work frantically to stop the hemorrhage. You've seen infections set in, the fever rising, the woman becoming delirious and dying days after what seemed like a successful birth. Childbirth is the most dangerous thing you will ever do, more dangerous than any battle most men will face. And you'll do it over and over and over again. The process itself is shrouded in female mystery, attended by midwives and female relatives, while men wait anxiously elsewhere. When your time comes, you'll labor in a darkened room, the windows covered to keep out evil spirits and cold air. The midwife will check your progress with her fingers, feel the baby's position, offer you herbs to strengthen your contractions or dull your pain. Other women will hold your hands, support your back, whisper encouragement or prayers. There's no real pain relief, beyond herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. Willow bark tea, which contains a precursor to aspirin, helps a little. Mugwort and raspberry leaf are said to ease labor. Some women drink wine or ale to dull the edge of pain. But mostly, you just endure. You squat or kneel or lean against the birthing stool. And you push and you scream if you need to. Because everyone understands that this is agony beyond words. Medieval people don't fully understand the anatomy of birth. They know the baby comes out through the birth canal, obviously, but the mechanics of labor, the role of contractions, the way the cervix dilates, these details are fuzzy or completely wrong. Some believe the baby actively pushes its way out. Others think the womb contracts to expel the child. The concept of the pelvis and its dimensions, so crucial to understanding difficult births, isn't well understood at all. When something goes wrong, the options are limited and terrible. If the baby is positioned wrong, breech or sideways, the midwife might try to turn it manually, reaching inside to manipulate the tiny body into a better position. This is agonizingly painful and often unsuccessful. If the baby dies in the womb, it must still be delivered, and the process can take days. The woman laboring to birth her dead child, while grief and physical pain merge into something unbearable in extreme cases. When the baby is stuck and both mother and child are dying, there's a horrific choice to be made. Some midwives know how to perform embryotomy, cutting the baby apart inside the womb to remove it piece by piece and save the mother's life. It's a last resort, forbidden by the church, which prioritizes the baby's soul over the mother's life. But some practitioners do it anyway. When faced with the certainty of losing both mother and child, there's no cesarean section as we know it. The surgery exists in theory, described in ancient texts, but it's only performed on dying or dead mothers to try to save the baby, never the reverse. A woman who undergoes this procedure does not survive it in the medieval period. The wound is too extensive, infection inevitable, blood loss unstoppable, so you labor and you pray, and you hope that your body will do what women's bodies have done since the beginning of time. Most of the time, it does. Most births, even in medieval Europe, end with a living mother and a living child. But the shadow of the other possibility is always there, darkening even the joy of a successful delivery. And if you survive the birth, there's the recovery period. The church mandates a period of lying in, during which you're supposed to rest and regain your strength. For wealthy women, this might mean weeks of bed rest attended by servants. For peasant women, it might mean a few days before you're back to your regular work, carrying water and tending animals with your newborn strapped to your chest. You'll bleed for weeks after birth, a discharge called lochia that medieval people understand is normal but don't really know how to explain. You'll have to manage this with rags that you wash and reuse, adding laundry to your endless list of tasks. Your breasts will swell with milk, becoming hard and painful until the baby nurses enough to regulate the supply. You might develop mastitis, an infection of the breast tissue that causes fever and intense pain. Or you might struggle to produce enough milk. Watching your baby fail to thrive and knowing there's little you can do about it. And through all of this, you're expected to be available to your husband again as soon as the church permits. That 40-day waiting period after birth isn't for your benefit. It's to ensure you're ritually clean before resuming marital relations. Whether you feel physically or emotionally ready is beside the point. Some women develop what we'd now call postpartum depression or PTSD from traumatic births. They become anxious, withdrawn, unable to bond with their babies. Medieval medicine attributes this to wandering wombs or humoral imbalances and treats it with herbs or bloodletting, neither of which address the actual psychological trauma. Many women simply suffer in silence, doing what needs to be done because there's no other choice. Miscarriage is heartbreakingly common. Perhaps as many as 1 in 4 or 5 pregnancies ending before the baby can survive. You feel the cramping, the bleeding, the passage of tissue and tiny body parts, and you mourn alone or with other women who understand. The Church's position on miscarried babies is complicated and cruel. Unbaptized infants can't enter heaven, so these tiny souls are lost to limbo, a theological nowhere. You grieve not just the child you lost, but also for its imperiled eternal soul, stillbirth. When a baby is born dead after a full pregnancy is perhaps even worse. You've carried this child for months, felt it move and kick, imagined its face and future, and then the movements stop. And you know with terrible certainty what's coming. You still have to labor, to birth this dead baby, to hold its tiny, perfect body and mourn what will never be. Some women, facing endless pregnancies and the constant risk of death, seek ways to prevent conception. This is dangerous territory. The Church explicitly forbids contraception, viewing it as a form of murder, since it prevents souls from being created. But women whisper about herbs that can prevent pregnancy. Tansy, pennyroyal, root. They share knowledge about timing, about avoiding sex during fertile periods. Though understanding of the menstrual cycle is imperfect at best, more desperate women seek herbs that can induce abortion in early pregnancy. This is both medically risky and morally condemned, but it happens. Midwives who provide these services walk a fine line, helping women in need while risking accusation of murder or witchcraft if caught. Your body is a battleground. It's the site of your greatest power, your ability to create life, and your greatest vulnerability. Every pregnancy is a gamble with your life. Every child you bear increases the likelihood that one pregnancy will be the one that kills you. And yet, you have no real choice in the matter. Your fertility isn't yours to control. So you wake with that familiar nausea. Place a hand on your still flat belly and steel yourself for what's coming. Another pregnancy, another birth, another roll of the dice. You've survived before. Maybe you'll survive again. And maybe, this time, the baby will live and thrive, and it will all be worth it. That's what you tell yourself, anyway. As the sun rises and another day of endless work begins, pleasure, desire, and secret joys, it's late evening, and the children are finally asleep. Your husband reaches for you across the narrow bed, and instead of the usual dutiful response, you feel something else stir: anticipation, warmth, desire. His hand finds yours in the darkness, and you realize with a small shock that you want this, not because the Church says you must, not because children need to be made, but simply because you want to feel close to him, to experience that particular intimacy that belongs only to the two of you. This is the part of medieval sexuality that often gets lost in discussions of peekaboo church rules and mortality rates. The fact that people experienced pleasure, real, genuine, physical, and emotional pleasure, despite all the restrictions and dangers, despite the fear and guilt and constant regulation, medieval people fell in love, felt desire, and found joy in their bodies and their relationships. Let's talk about pleasure. Let's talk about the ways people navigated around, through, and sometimes directly against the prohibitions to find moments of genuine connection and delight. Understand that the Church's condemnation of pleasure wasn't as absolute or uniform as you might think. Yes, the official line was that sex should be about procreation, not recreation. But there were cracks in this facade, spaces where pleasure was acknowledged and even, in a limited way, endorsed. Remember that medical theory about conception requiring female orgasm. That idea had real consequences. If women needed to climax in order to conceive, then husbands had a duty to ensure their wives experienced pleasure. Several medieval medical texts actually provide advice on foreplay and technique, suggesting that men should take time to arouse their wives, that they should use gentle touches and words, that they should wait until the woman is ready before proceeding. One medieval medical text, written by a physician advising his aristocratic patron, explicitly states that the husband should stroke her breasts and pudenda, and speak to her coaxingly and enticingly before intercourse. It advises patience, suggesting that rushing the act will prevent conception. The language is clinical, framed entirely around reproductive success. But the practical result is an instruction manual for mutual pleasure. Some theologians, too, were more nuanced than the strict prohibitionist line might suggest. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential medieval thinkers, argued that pleasure in marital sex wasn't sinful in itself. What mattered was the intention. If you approached sex with the right mindset, procreation and unity, then the pleasure that resulted was natural and acceptable. The sin came when pleasure itself became the primary goal, overriding reason and moderation. This theological hair-splitting might seem absurd, but it created a space for married couples to enjoy sex without overwhelming guilt. As long as you told yourself and your confessor that you were primarily motivated by proper intentions, the pleasure you experienced along the way was permissible, and people did experience pleasure. Lots of it, if the historical evidence is any guide. Love letters between married couples survive from the medieval period, and they're remarkably tender and passionate. Spouses separated by war or travel write to each other, expressing not just affection, but genuine longing, both emotional and physical. One medieval wife writes to her husband, "Away on military campaign, I count the days until your return. My love, for the nights are cold without you, and my heart aches for your embrace." The language is careful, avoiding anything too explicit that might scandalize if the letter were intercepted, but the subtext is clear. She misses him, not just as a companion, but as a lover. Another letter, this one from a husband to his wife, speaks of the sweetness of your company that I crave more than food or wine. These aren't people enduring sex as a grim duty. These are people who genuinely desire each other, who find joy in physical intimacy. Poetry and literature from the period also provide glimpses of pleasure and desire. Yes, there's courtly love, with all its unfulfilled longing. But there's also a whole genre of more earthy body writing that celebrates sexual pleasure. The fabliaux, comic tales, popular in medieval France, often involve sexual adventures, usually with a comic or satirical edge. These stories wouldn't exist if their audience didn't recognize and find humor in sexual desire. Some of this literature is surprisingly explicit. There are medieval poems that describe lovemaking in detail, that celebrate female beauty and sexual prowess, that acknowledge female desire as a real and powerful force. One famous poem describes a woman's body, part by part, lingering over every curve and hollow, clearly written by someone who found the female form not sinful but beautiful and arousing. Music, too, carries traces of desire. Troubadour songs might officially be about distant, unattainable ladies. But listen closely, and you'll hear the heat beneath the metaphor. Some songs are less subtle. Drinking songs and work songs, with Bodhi lyrics that speak directly about sex, often with humor and enthusiasm, in the private space of the marriage bed. Away from church surveillance and social judgment, couples found their own ways to experience pleasure. They learned each other's bodies, discovered what felt good, developed their own intimate language of touch and response. Some couples undoubtedly had miserable sex lives, but others developed genuine, erotic partnerships. Foreplay wasn't just a medical recommendation. It was something couples discovered through experimentation. Kissing, which the church sometimes viewed suspiciously as overly passionate, was a way to express affection and build arousal. Touching, exploring each other's bodies, finding sensitive spots, and learning how to elicit pleasure, these were part of how intimacy deepened over years of marriage and orgasm. That mysterious, powerful experience that medieval medicine couldn't fully explain but recognized as real happened. Women climaxed, and not just because their husbands were following medical advice for conception. They climaxed because the human body responds to stimulation, because pleasure is a fundamental part of sexuality, because desire builds and releases regardless of whether the church approves. Some evidence suggests that medieval people knew about and practiced oral sex, despite strong church condemnation of unnatural acts. References are oblique and often appear in penitential handbooks listing sins to confess, which tells us that people were doing these things frequently enough that priests needed to know how to assign penance. The fact that the manuals keep repeating the same prohibitions generation after generation suggests people kept ignoring them. Masturbation, too, was common despite condemnation. Young people exploring their own bodies, married people finding release when their spouse was unavailable or during forbidden times. Widows and widowers managing their continued desires, self-pleasure happened, and people confessed it, did their penance, and often did it again. There's even evidence of sex toys, though the record is fragmentary. References to artificial instruments appear in some confessional manuals, suggesting that medieval people found ways to enhance pleasure beyond what their bodies alone could provide. Archaeological finds of phallic objects from medieval sites might have been religious symbols or fertility charms, but some scholars suggest at least some had more practical, pleasurable uses. Aphrodisiacs were popular, suggesting that people weren't content with dutiful sex but wanted to enhance desire and performance. Oysters, asparagus, honey, wine, various herbs, and spices all were believed to increase libido. Whether they actually worked is debatable, but the fact that people sought them out reveals a desire for better, more pleasurable sex. Love magic and charms existed in the folk tradition. Spells and rituals designed to attract lovers or enhance sexual attraction. A woman might sew a charm into her clothing or sleep with a love potion under her pillow. A man might wear an amulet believed to increase his virility. The church condemned these practices as superstition or witchcraft, but they persisted because people wanted help with love and desire. Some couples must have developed quite sophisticated sexual repertoires over years of marriage, learning not just how to make babies, but how to please each other, how to maintain desire and passion even through the challenges of constant pregnancy, hard work, and communal living. These are the stories that don't often make it into historical records, but they must have existed. Consider the evidence of second marriages, particularly when a widow or widower chose to remarry. The church allowed it, though some authorities suggested celibate widowhood was more holy. But many people chose to marry again, even when they already had children and didn't strictly need a spouse for economic support. Why? Surely part of the reason was companionship, including sexual companionship. People who'd known marital intimacy missed it when it was gone and sought it again. Are you still awake? Or are you drifting off peacefully? Either is fine. These stories of medieval pleasure and desire are here whether you're fully conscious or letting them filter into your dreams. There's something soothing about knowing that people, even in difficult times, found joy. There's also evidence that some married couples genuinely fell in love with each other over time, even if their marriages were initially arranged. They developed affection, respect, and yes, desire for each other. They became partners, not just in the economic and social sense, but in an emotional and physical sense as well. Childbirth, for all its dangers, also created intimacy. A husband who supported his wife through labor, who worried for her safety, who rejoiced at the birth of their child. These experiences could deepen emotional bonds. And those emotional bonds often found physical expression once the wife had recovered. The long winter nights, dark and cold, when couples huddled together for warmth in their shared bed, created opportunities for intimacy. Touch leads to more touch. Warmth leads to heat. Comfort leads to desire. These moments, unscheduled and unplanned, were probably when some of the most genuine sexual connection happened. Humor helped too. Medieval people joked about sex, laughed about the awkwardness and absurdity of bodies and desire. The folblios are full of sexual humor, suggesting that people found the whole business ridiculous and delightful in equal measure. Laughter and pleasure are closely linked, and couples who could laugh together probably enjoyed each other more. So yes, there was pleasure. Real, genuine, often unrecorded pleasure. People made love, not just dutiful reproductive sex, but actual lovemaking that brought them closer together. They experienced arousal and climax, tenderness and passion. They found ways to express desire despite living in a culture that tried very hard to suppress it. And you move closer to him, feeling the familiar comfort of his body next to yours. Whatever happens next, whether you make love or simply fall asleep in each other's arms, this intimacy is yours. It exists despite the church's rules, despite the danger of pregnancy, despite it's a small rebellion, a quiet joy, a very human connection in a world that often feels inhuman, and sometimes that's enough. The margins and the fourbinure, walking through the narrow streets of a medieval city as dusk falls. The light fading to purple-gray, and you notice a woman standing in a doorway. Her dress is a particular shade of yellow, or maybe there's a stripe on her sleeve, some marking required by law, so everyone knows what she is. A prostitute. Your eyes meet for just a moment before you look away, but in that glance you see something unexpected. Not shame, not desperation, but a kind of weary professionalism. She's working, just like the baker, and the blacksmith, and the wool merchant, except her work is sex, and that changes everything. Welcome to the margins of medieval sexuality. The spaces outside church-sanctioned marriage, where desire still flowed, rules were bent or broken, and people found ways to satisfy needs that weren't supposed to exist. Let's start with prostitution, because it's everywhere in medieval cities. Despite all the church's teachings about chastity, despite laws against fornication, despite the theoretical sinfulness of sex outside marriage, prostitution is a well-established part of urban life, and not underground either. Many cities actually regulate and license brothels, collect taxes on them, and incorporate them into the municipal structure. The logic is pragmatic, even cynical. City authorities recognize that men, especially young unmarried men, have sexual desires. Better, they reason, to channel those desires toward professional sex workers than to have these men bothering respectable women, assaulting servants, or engaging in homosexual acts, which are considered much more serious sins. Prostitutes serve as a kind of safety valve, absorbing excess male lust that might otherwise destabilize social order. So brothels operate openly in designated areas, red light districts, before the term existed. In some cities, the brothel is municipally owned and operated. The city employs a manager, often a woman called a brothel keeper or madam, who oversees the sex workers, maintains order, and ensures taxes are paid. The women working there are subject to regulations. They must undergo periodic health inspections. They're restricted in where they can live and walk. They're required to wear identifying clothing. The women themselves come from various backgrounds. Some are desperately poor, turning to sex work as a last resort when other employment isn't available or doesn't pay enough. Others are widows without family support. Some are young women who've been seduced and abandoned, their ruined reputations making respectable marriage impossible. A few apparently choose the work, finding it preferable to the back-breaking labor and low pay of other available options. Life as a medieval prostitute is hard and dangerous. You're socially stigmatized, legally restricted, vulnerable to violence from clients, and at constant risk of disease and pregnancy. The money can be decent compared to other women's work, but much of it goes to the brothel keeper or must be paid in taxes and fines. You age out quickly. Prostitution is a young woman's trade, and by your 30s you're likely considered past your prime, facing poverty and few options. Yet there's also evidence of agency and community. Some prostitutes band together for protection and mutual support. Some accumulate enough money to eventually leave the trade. A few successful madams become wealthy and respected in their own right, owning property and wielding influence. It's not a life anyone would choose if better options existed. But within the constraints of medieval women's limited opportunities, some made the best of it. The Church's position on prostitution is characteristically contradictory. Officially, prostitution is sinful, and prostitutes are grave sinners in constant need of repentance. Churches and religious orders run Magdalene houses, institutions designed to reform prostitutes by teaching them respectable trades and encouraging them to embrace chastity. Some women use these institutions to escape the trade. Others find them oppressive and leave to return to sex work. But the Church also tacitly accepts prostitution's existence. St. Augustine famously argued that prostitution, while sinful, serves a social function, preventing worse sexual sins. Some theologians compare prostitutes to sewers in a palace unpleasant but necessary. Priests hear prostitutes' confessions and assign them penance just like any other sinner. Prostitutes are buried in consecrated ground, though often in separate areas from respectable women. Now, let's talk about adultery. Sex between married people and someone other than their spouse. This is much more serious in medieval eyes than prostitution. Adultery threatens the family structure, clouds the question of legitimate heirs, and suggests profound moral failure. Yet, it happens constantly. For men, especially wealthy men, adultery is common and often quietly tolerated. A nobleman might keep a mistress, sometimes quite openly. He might father illegitimate children and even provide for them, though they can never inherit on equal terms with legitimate offspring. His wife is expected to endure this situation with dignified silence. For women, adultery is far more dangerous. An unfaithful wife risks not just her reputation, but her life. In some regions, a husband has the legal right to kill an adulterous wife and her lover if caught in the act. Even where the penalty is less extreme, an unfaithful woman faces public humiliation, physical punishment, abandonment, or confinement in a convent. The double standard is glaring and brutal, despite the risks. Women do commit adultery, usually in situations where they have some protection or power. A noblewoman might take a lover from among her husband's knights or courtiers, banking on her social status to shield her from the worst consequences. A merchant's wife left alone for months while her husband travels might find comfort elsewhere. Sometimes these affairs are about desire. Sometimes they're about emotional connection, lacking in the arranged marriage. Sometimes they're about revenge or power, or simply the human need for touch and intimacy. Church courts and secular courts handled dozens of adultery cases, the records revealing a messy landscape of accusation, denial, witnesses testifying to seeing the couple entering a bedroom together, arguments about whether actual intercourse occurred or just suspicious proximity. The legal process is invasive and humiliating, particularly for women, who might be subjected to physical examinations or required to prove their virtue through oath-taking rituals. Then there are the relationships that exist in even murkier territory, same-sex love and desire. This is forbidden territory, condemned by church and law as sodomy or the sin against nature, punishable by death in theory. Though actual prosecutions are relatively rare, but same-sex desire doesn't disappear just because it's forbidden. We have evidence of it in multiple forms. Passionate friendships between monks that seem to cross into erotic territory. Accusations in court records, cryptic references in literature, and the occasional detailed confession or prosecution that reveals what was happening behind closed doors. Medieval people don't understand homosexuality as an identity the way modern people do. There's no concept of being gay or lesbian as a category of person. Instead, there are acts, sinful acts, that anyone might commit if they weren't vigilant against temptation. This means that same-sex desire is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, acknowledged as a potential sin for everyone, while being specifically attached to no one. Some historians argue that this actually provided a kind of cover. If same-sex acts are just another temptation, rather than a defining identity, then people engaging in such acts could maintain their social position as long as they were discreet and confessed their sins. The monk who has a passionate attachment to another monk isn't a homosexual in medieval thinking. He's a sinner struggling with temptation like any other. Evidence of female same-sex relationships is scarcer than male, partly because women's lives were less documented generally, and partly because sex between women was often not taken as seriously as sex between men. The logic was grotesque. Without a penis, how could real sex occur? This meant that intimate female friendships could exist with less suspicion, and what we might read as lesbian relationships could be dismissed by contemporaries as merely close friendship. Nuns living together in convents, sharing beds, common practice in a time when beds were expensive. Developing intense emotional bonds. Where's the line between friendship and romance? Probably different people drew it differently. Some of these relationships were undoubtedly sexual. Others were passionate but chaste. Still others existed in some undefined space in between. There are documented cases of women living as men, sometimes for years, working male trades, and even marrying other women. When discovered, these cases caused scandal and confusion. Was this fraud, heresy, sexual sign? The legal and religious authorities struggled to categorize something that didn't fit their understanding of gender and sexuality. Transgender identity, as we'd understand it today, wasn't a concept medieval people had language for, but people whose internal sense of gender didn't match their assigned sex undoubtedly existed. Some found ways to live as their true gender, at least partially. Others suffered in silence, unable to articulate or act on feelings they couldn't explain. Back to that woman in the doorway wearing the required yellow stripe. You've passed her, and now you're thinking about all the various ways people find intimacy, connection, pleasure, and love outside the narrow channel the church prescribes. It's a rich, complex landscape of human behavior, messy and real. Medieval people weren't different from us. They experienced desire in all its variety. They fell in love with inappropriate people, wanted what they couldn't have, made bad decisions, took risks, and sometimes found genuine connection in unexpected places. The rules were strict, but life was complicated, and people are endlessly creative in finding ways around restrictions. As darkness falls completely and you make your way home, you're aware that all around you, in houses and rooms you can't see, people are negotiating desire and connection in dozens of ways. Some married couples are making love, some with affection, and some with duty. Some unmarried people are stealing moments together despite the risk. Some are alone, managing their desires through fantasy or self-pleasure. Some are paying for sex. Some are selling it. Some are loving people they're not supposed to love, in ways they're not supposed to. It's all human, all of it. The margins and the mainstream, the forbidden and the sanctioned. Medieval sexuality wasn't simple or uniform. It was, like sexuality in any era, a complicated mix of need, desire, fear, love, power, pleasure, and pain. And understanding that complexity helps us see medieval people not as distant figures ruled by alien beliefs, but as humans fundamentally like ourselves, trying to navigate the gap between what they were told they should want and what they actually felt, what they believed could go wrong. You wake in the middle of the night from a vivid dream, your heart pounding, your body responding in ways that fill you with confusion and guilt. In the dream, a figure came to you, beautiful and terrible, and touched you with hands that were both burning hot and ice cold. The pleasure was intense, overwhelming, and entirely unwanted. Now you're awake, tangled in damp sheets, and the fear hits you. Was it just a dream, or were you visited by a demon? And if it was a demon, what does that mean for your soul? Welcome to the terrifying landscape of medieval fears about sexuality, where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual were porous, where sex could go catastrophically wrong in ways that endangered not just your body, but your eternal soul, and where supernatural forces were always waiting to exploit your weakness and desire. Let's start with those demons that visit in the night. Because the medieval belief in succubi and incubi was widespread and taken very seriously. A succubus is a female demon who seduces men while they sleep. An incubus is a male demon who assaults women in their beds. These aren't metaphorical. Medieval people believed these entities were real, physical beings with the power to interact with human bodies. The theology behind this belief is complicated. Demons, being fallen angels, don't have physical bodies of their own. But medieval scholars argued that they could assume corporeal form, or at least create the illusion of it. The purpose of these nocturnal visits isn't pleasure. Demons don't experience human emotions, but corruption. By engaging in sexual acts with humans, demons steal vital essence, pollute the soul, and sometimes even cause pregnancy. Yes, you read that right. There are medieval texts that describe how an incubus might collect semen from a sleeping man, then transform into a succubus and deposit that semen in a sleeping woman, causing her to conceive a demon-influenced child. This convoluted explanation allowed medieval people to account for suspicious pregnancies, children born with deformities or unusual characteristics, and the general anxiety that sex, even in sleep, could have demonic consequences. If you experienced what we'd now call a wet dream or nocturnal emission, you might interpret it as a demonic visit. Men especially worried about this because the loss of semen without procreative purpose was considered wasteful and possibly sinful. Was it your fault if a demon caused it? Medieval confessors debated this point. Some said that if you didn't consent, even in your dreams, it wasn't a sin. Others argued that the very fact of demonic visitation suggested you'd done something to invite it, some spiritual weakness or previous sin that made you vulnerable. Women who dreamed of sexual encounters faced similar fears and questions. Did you enjoy it? Did you resist? Could you have woken yourself up? The interrogation could be humiliating, and the suggested remedies often made things worse. Fasting to weaken the body and make it less appealing to demons. Sleeping with blessed objects, confession and penance. In extreme cases, exorcism. These beliefs about demonic sexuality connected to broader fears about conception and pregnancy. Medieval people worried constantly about what could go wrong when you mixed male and female seed. What if you had sex at the wrong time, in the wrong position, with the wrong thoughts in your head? Could that affect the baby? There was widespread belief that monstrous births babies born with deformities, disabilities, or unusual features resulted from improper sex. Maybe the parents had sex during menstruation, which was forbidden and considered polluting. Maybe they used an unnatural position. Maybe the woman thought about another man during conception. Maybe they had sex on a forbidden holy day. All of these transgressions could, supposedly, mark the child. This belief was cruel and damaging, adding layers of guilt and blame to the already profound grief parents felt when a child was born with problems or didn't survive. Mothers especially bore the burden of these accusations. If something was wrong with the baby, it must be because she did something wrong, thought something wrong, or was somehow inherently wrong herself. Some texts even described specific consequences for specific sexual sins. Have sex standing up, and your child might be born lame. Have sex during your menstrual period, and the child could have skin diseases. Have sex too enthusiastically, with too much pleasure, and you might produce a child marked by that excesper, haps, oversexed themselves, or prone to sins of the flesh. These beliefs persisted despite visible evidence to the contrary. Plenty of children born to pious couples following all the rules still had disabilities. Plenty of children born from illicit unions were perfectly healthy, but cognitive dissonance is powerful, and when beliefs are wrapped up in religious authority and widespread cultural agreement, individual contrary examples don't dismantle them. Then there are the fears about impotence, inability to perform sexually, which could destroy a marriage and a man's reputation. Medieval people believed that impotence could be caused by witchcraft, specifically by a curse called tying the knot or ligature. A witch or cunning person, often hired by a jealous rival or scorned woman, could perform a ritual that rendered a man unable to achieve erection with his wife. The supposed cure for this curse varied. Some recommended counterspell. Others suggested pilgrimages to certain saints known for helping with fertility issues. Still others involved elaborate rituals of untying physical knots while reciting prayers. The Church officially condemned belief in such magic as superstition, but unofficially, plenty of priests knew these folk remedies and tacitly approved their use. A man who claimed to be the victim of ligature had to be careful. Admitting to impotence was humiliating and could lead to marriage annulment, but claiming it was caused by witchcraft rather than natural inadequacy at least preserved some dignity and opened the possibility of cure. This created a strange situation where accusations of sexual cursing became entangled with marriage disputes, property disagreements, and neighborhood feuds. Women could be accused of causing impotence too, even in their own husbands. A wife who didn't conceive might be blamed for somehow rejecting or neutralizing her husband's seed through witchcraft or simply through having a naturally cold hostile womb. The intersection of sexuality, fertility, and witchcraft accusation was a dangerous place for women. Love potions and aphrodisiacs occupy an ambiguous territory between helpful remedy and dangerous magic. Everyone knew about herbs and foods said to increase desire or fertility, but how they were prepared and administered mattered. A love potion made with prayers and common kitchen herbs might be acceptable, but one that involved rituals performed at midnight, strange ingredients, or invocations that sounded suspiciously like demons, that was witchcraft, and you could be prosecuted for it. Women who had knowledge of these substances walked a careful line. Midwives, herbalists, and cunning women provided services that were simultaneously needed and suspected. The same woman who helped with difficult births might also be consulted for love magic. And if anything went wrong, if a love potion made someone sick or a pregnancy charm failed to work, accusations could fly. The fear of sexual magic intensified during the late medieval period as witch hunting became more common. Suddenly, any woman with knowledge of herbs, any person who seemed to have influence over others' sexual or romantic lives, any situation where desire or fertility acted strangely could become evidence of witchcraft. And witchcraft accusations, once made, were very hard to disprove. Imagine being accused of causing your neighbor's impotence through magic. How do you prove you didn't? You can't. You can only submit to investigation, possibly torture, and hope that somehow you'll be believed. Many weren't. Many women died because of accusations, rooted in anxieties about sexuality and power. There's also the fear of female sexuality itself, which medieval culture viewed as particularly dangerous and uncontrollable. Women were thought to be more lustful than men, more easily corrupted, more likely to be influenced by demons. This created a paranoid logic. Women's sexual desire was both natural due to their cold, wet humors needing male heat, and unnatural because excessive desire came from demons. A woman who expressed overt sexual desire, who seemed to enjoy sex too much, who couldn't be satisfied by her husband, might be suspected of demonic influence or of being a witch herself. Female pleasure was necessary for conception, but too much pleasure, or pleasure expressed too freely, was dangerous. This impossible standard meant women were constantly policed. Be sexual enough to fulfill your marital duty and conceive, but not so sexual that you seem lustful. Experience pleasure enough to aid conception, but not so much pleasure that you're suspected of sin. It was a tightrope walk that many women failed, at least in the eyes of their communities. The elderly were especially vulnerable to accusations related to sexual magic. Postmenopausal women, no longer serving the reproductive function that gave women value, were often viewed with suspicion. If such a woman had knowledge of herbs, if she'd served as a midwife, if she'd helped women with fertility or contraception over the years, she might, in her old age, find herself accused of causing impotence, preventing conception, or consorting with demons. Young, unmarried women faced different but equally intense scrutiny. A girl who attracted male attention too easily might be suspected of using love magic. One who was too beautiful, too charming, or too confident might be accused of witchcraft. The logic was circular. If men desired you, you must have used magic to make them desire you. Because men's desire was women's fault, as you lie there in the dark, trying to calm your racing heart after that disturbing dream. You realize that sexuality in medieval Europe is shot through with fear. Fear of demons, fear of pregnancy, fear of infertility, fear of impotence, fear of witchcraft, fear of pleasure, fear of desire itself. Every sexual thought or act carries potential danger, not just physical, but spiritual and social. And yet, this is important. Most people, most of the time, didn't live in constant terror. These fears existed, certainly, and sometimes they erupted into accusations, trials, and tragedy. But day to day, people went about their lives, had sex, made babies, experienced desire, and didn't assume every dream was demonic or every odd event was witchcraft. The fears were there, lurking in the background, shaping behavior and belief in subtle ways. They were tools of social control, ways of enforcing gender norms and sexual restrictions. They were also genuine expressions of anxiety in a world where so much was beyond human control and understanding. You eventually drift back to sleep, your prayers recited, your fears acknowledged and set aside. Tomorrow you'll mention the dream to your confessor, maybe, or maybe you'll keep it to yourself. Another secret in a life full of them. The night passes, the demons, whether real or imagined, fade with the dawn, and life continues, as it always does, complicated and messy and very, very human. Closing reflection. The candle has burned low, its wax pooling and reforming in organic shapes that cast shifting shadows on the walls. You're back where we started, in that wedding night room, but now you understand so much more. The fear, the confusion, the fumbling awkwardness of that first encounter. They all make sense now, in the context of a culture that wrapped sexuality in layers of shame, duty, and religious anxiety, while simultaneously making it absolutely central to social order and personal identity. Let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've explored together, to find the threads that connect these disparate pieces of the medieval sexual experience into something resembling a coherent picture. Medieval sexuality was above all else contradictory. The Church preached that sex was shameful and that celibacy was the highest form of spiritual purity. Yet it also insisted that marriage was a sacred sacrament and that producing children was a holy duty. Women were simultaneously valued for their reproductive capacity and blamed for the lustful desires they supposedly provoked in men. Pleasure was condemned as sinful, but also recognized as necessary for conception. The rules governing sexual behavior were incredibly detailed and restrictive, yet they were widely ignored or selectively enforced. These contradictions weren't bugs in the system. They were features. They created a tension that kept people off balance, always uncertain whether they were sinning or fulfilling God's will, always dependent on religious and social authorities to navigate the impossible maze of sexual morality. This uncertainty was, itself, a form of control. But what's remarkable, what shines through when you really dig into the historical record, is the sheer persistence of human desire and connection despite all the obstacles. People fell in love in a world that prioritized arranged marriages. They found pleasure in bodies they'd been taught to see as shameful. They formed intimate bonds that transcended the transactional nature of matrimony. They experienced the full range of human sexuality, from tender affection to raw lust, from lifelong partnership to brief encounter. Despite living in a culture that tried very hard to reduce sex to a single, narrow, procreative function, medieval people were not different from us in their fundamental humanity. They wanted to be desired and to desire. They sought connection, touch, intimacy. They experienced jealousy, longing, satisfaction, and disappointment. They had good sex and bad sex, loving partnerships and miserable marriages. They broke rules, felt guilty about it, and often broke the same rules again. They were, in other words, recognizably human in ways that span centuries. What was different was the framework within which they had to express these universal human experiences. The medieval framework was rigid, religiously defined, heavily gendered, and often brutal in its enforcement. Women bore the heaviest burden, their bodies controlled and policed, their sexuality simultaneously feared and exploited, their suffering in childbirth accepted as both inevitable and deserved. And yet, women found agency within these constraints. They developed networks of female knowledge about herbs, fertility, and their own bodies. They supported each other through the dangers of childbirth. They negotiated with husbands, priests, and social expectations to carve out small spaces of autonomy. Some medieval women lived lives of genuine partnership with their spouses. Others found strength in communities of women, in convents, or simply in friendships that sustained them. Not all women were victims, though the system was certainly oppressive. Many were survivors, creators, agents of their own lives within the narrow options available. Men, too, navigated complex expectations. Be virile, but not lustful. Be potent, but control. Desire women, but don't desire them too much. Satisfy your wife, but don't enjoy it too much yourself. These contradictory demands created their own pressures, their own forms of suffering. Though of course men's suffering occurred within a structure of power and privilege that women didn't share. The historical record gives us glimpses of genuine love across the centuries. Couples who chose to remarry after being widowed, suggesting they'd found companionship and intimacy worth seeking again. Letters between spouses expressing real affection and longing. Tomb inscriptions commemorating beloved partners. Poetry celebrating marital love alongside the more famous courtly love tradition. These pieces of evidence remind us that medieval marriage wasn't always joyless duty. Sometimes, despite everything, people built lives of mutual care and even passion. What about those on the margins? The people whose sexualities didn't fit the narrow mold. Their stories are harder to find, but no less real. Same-sex desire existed, and people found ways to express it despite enormous risk. Gender non-conforming individuals existed, some living as their true gender with varying degrees of success and acceptance. People who didn't want to marry, who chose religious life not for piety, but as an escape from mandated heterosexuality and reproduction. They're there too, if you look closely enough. The prostitutes, the adults, the women accused of witchcraft for their knowledge of contraception or abortion. They're part of this story too. They remind us that medieval sexuality wasn't just what happened in marriage beds between pious couples. It was also transactional, forbidden, dangerous, and complicated. It was survival and choice and coercion all mixed together in ways that defy easy moral judgment from our modern perspective as we close this journey through medieval sexuality. I want to acknowledge something important. We've covered difficult topics tonight: maternal mortality, sexual violence, oppressive social structures, gender-based violence, and religious trauma. These aren't easy subjects. And if you're feeling heavy or disturbed by some of what we've discussed, that's a completely valid response. Medieval life was hard, especially for women and marginalized people. Their suffering was real, and we honor them by not looking away from that reality. But I also want to emphasize the moments of joy we've found, the pleasure that people discovered despite being told it was wrong, the love that bloomed in arranged marriages, the communities of support, the humor and irreverence that appear in margins of manuscripts and in Bodhi songs, the sheer, stubborn human refusal to be entirely controlled, even by the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. Medieval people's sexual lives were richer, more complicated, and more human than the stereotypes suggest. They weren't just repressed automatons, mindlessly following church rules or writhing in sinful chaos. They were individuals and couples navigating a difficult system, making choices with the information and options available to them, sometimes suffering, sometimes thriving, usually doing some complicated mixture of both. What can we learn from this exploration? Perhaps that human sexuality has always been complex, that no set of rules or moral frameworks has ever fully contained or controlled it. Perhaps that gender-based oppression has deep historical roots that we're still working to untangle today. Perhaps that the tension between religious or social ideals and lived reality is nothing new, that people have always found ways to be themselves even under restrictive circumstances. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler, that people in the past were people, not so different from us, deserving of empathy and understanding rather than judgment or condescension. They did their best with what they had, in circumstances far more difficult than most of us will ever face. Their stories, preserved in fragments across centuries, deserve to be told with honesty and compassion. So here we are, back in that candlelit room on that wedding night. The couple has fallen asleep now, curled together in the narrow bed, their first awkward encounter behind them, and an uncertain future ahead. Maybe they'll learn to love each other. Maybe they won't. Maybe she survived the many pregnancies that await her. Maybe she won't. Maybe they'll find pleasure together. Or maybe sex will always be dutiful and joyless. Maybe they'll break the church's rules regularly and confess without real repentance. Maybe they'll try desperately to follow every prohibition and fail and suffer for that failure. Whatever happens, their story is one of millions, most lost to time, but all of them real, all of them human, all of them part of the great, complicated story of how people have loved, desired, suffered, and connected throughout history. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these difficult, beautiful, complicated stories from the medieval past. If something surprised you, if something challenged your assumptions, or made you think differently about history or sexuality or human nature, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What was the most unexpected thing you learned tonight? What resonated with you? What troubled you? And if you're drifting off to sleep now, if these stories are fading into dreams, that's perfect. That's exactly what this space is for. Rest well, and know that across all the centuries that separate us from the medieval world, the fundamental human experiences of desire, love, fear, hope, and connection remain recognizable and real. The candle flickers one last time and goes out. The room falls into darkness, and in that darkness, the quiet breathing of two people learning to share a life together continues, as it has for countless couples across countless nights throughout human history. Sleep well.